So I guess we could get started. Um, Welcome everyone to the CUNY Book Talks series of the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and the Sciences. I'm Emily Sohmer Tai, who oversees the book talks. And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome Kenneth J. Ying, who teaches modern languages, literature, and linguistics at LaGuardia Community College, and is also a fellow at the Institute of Asian Research at the City University of New York. Dr. Ying is a graduate of Cornell and Georgetown University and has held fellowships from the ACLS, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, all to study his ongoing focus on the Dungan people, Central Asian Sino-Muslims, who are spread across a variety of different areas, all part of the former Soviet Union in Central Asia. His book, Dungan Folk Tales and Legends, made folk narratives of the Dungan people accessible to Anglophone readers for the first time, bringing to light works that until that point had only been available in Russian translation. And he is now here to discuss his most recent book. Yes, he's holding it up. Mystical Forest. Goodness gracious. Mystical Forest, collected poems and short stories of Dungan ethnographer Ali, now Dzhon, is that how you pronounce it?
Dzhon.
Dzhon, yes. Not so good for my Chinese, excuse me. And this is from Peter Lang. And if you look to the chat, you'll also notice that there is a 30% discount on the acquisition of the book for attendees of this book talk who are interested in Dr. Yin's research. But let him tell you a little bit more about it. We're so happy to welcome him, and we'll ask him now to take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Tai. And I'd also like to thank, of course, the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and Sciences, as well as the CUNY Graduate Center for hosting today's book talk. So I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides I want to show you. So let me just open that.
Are you able to share your screen?
Yeah.
I've made it possible, so it should be something you can do right now.
Right. Let me see. I clicked on it while I was sharing. Maybe I clicked on it too early. Let me open this, share screen. Here we go.
Bravo.
Great. Okay. So as Professor Tai said, I will be talking about my latest book, which is Mystical Forest, Collected Poems and Short Stories of Dungan Ethnographer Ali Dzhon. So I have that. Going to show the slideshow now from the beginning. Here we go. Okay, so the talk today is divided into 4 parts of differing length. And I'd like to begin by providing a brief introduction to the Dungan people. So the Hui are descendants, the Dungans are descendants of the Hui people, or the Sinophone or Chinese-speaking Muslims of China. And the Hui people, Huizu in Mandarin Chinese, are an ethno-religious group predominantly composed of Chinese-speaking Muslims. numbering approximately 10.5 million, according to the 2011 Chinese census, and they are distributed throughout China, mainly in the northwestern provinces and the Central Plain, or Zhongyuan region, as it's called in Chinese. So the Hui are one of 56 ethnic groups officially recognized by the People's Republic of China, which defines the Hui to include all historically Muslim communities not included in China's other ethnic groups. So including Uyghurs, Dongshang, Kazakhs, Kyrgyzs, Uzbeks, and others. So next, I'd like to speak briefly about the Dungan migrations from Northwest China to Central Asia. So this occurred in three major waves. The first occurred in the winter of 1877 to 1878 in the immediate aftermath of the failed Dungan revolt, which lasted from 1862 to 1877. And this was under the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. And this information comes from Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakov-Dyer. The revolt is also known as the Tongzhi Hui Revolt, or Tongzhi Hui Luan, which is the name in Mandarin Chinese and also the name that the Dungans use. And it's also sometimes referred to as the Hui Minorities War. And it was fought mostly during the reign of the Tongzhi Emperor, who ruled from 1861 to 1875 during the Qing dynasty. The second major wave of migration was from 1881 to 1884, and this was following the signing of the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881, which restored to China the Upper Ili Basin, which had been occupied by Russian troops since 1871 during the Dungan Revolt. So in accordance with the terms of the treaty, which required the withdrawal of the Russian troops from the Upper Ili Basin, or the Kuljia area, the Dungans, or the Hui, and the Taranchi, what the Uyghurs who lived in the area were called at the time, were allowed the option to move to the Russian side of the border, and many chose to do so rather than remain under the oppressive Chinese rule. And then the third wave of migration occurred in the first part of the 20th century until the border was closed in the early 1960s. And this was following the Great Chinese Famine, which lasted from roughly 1959 to 1961. So most of the original Dungan settlers were poor, illiterate peasants or small urban craftsmen who came from Gansu province, Shanxi province, and Xinjiang in China. So in terms of the numbers, the latest census data available as of 2020 indicate that there are an estimated 150,000 Dungans. And they live primarily in three areas. The first, as you can see on the map, is Kyrgyzstan, where according to the 2020 Kyrgyz census, there are 73,977 Dungans. The second republic that they live in is Kazakhstan, where according to the 2019 Kazakh census, there are 72,361 Dungans. And then the third republic that they appear in is Uzbekistan. So, and where there are approximately 3,000 Dungans, according to the 2009 estimates of the Dungan Cultural Center of Uzbekistan. And by tradition, the Dungans are Sunni Muslims of the Hanafi school, like most of their Central Asian neighbors. And the Dungans have traditionally had large families, often with between 6 and 8 children, and they enjoy a reputation as a hardworking and prosperous people. Okay. Now, in part two, I'd like to provide a brief biographical sketch of Ali Dzhon. And you see on the slide here, his full name in Russian is Ali Aliyevich Dzhon, and his name in Chinese is Zhang Erli. So Dzhon holds the rank of senior researcher in the Dungan and Chinese Studies Center of the National Academy of Sciences of the Republic of Kyrgyzstan. He holds an honorary title as Honored Worker of Science of the National Academy of Sciences of the Kyrgyz Republic as well. So in addition to the traditional research work he has been engaged in as an ethnographer since 1978, Dzhon began pursuing creative literary modes of expression in 1969 while a student of literature at the Przhevalsky State Pedagogical Institute in the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. So Dzhon's creative writing is rooted in his experiences as an ethnic Dungan in Central Asia during the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. In addition to the two published volumes of original Russian language poetry, Dzhon has published more than 50 scholarly monographs and articles in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, China, and Japan. And Dzhon's works in Chinese translation appear under his Chinese name, Zhang Erli. So next, I'd just like to show you a few of the photos that appear in my English language edition. So the first shows the Dzhon family in 1973. And you can see Dzhon's parents are in the front row in the middle, his mother and father. Dzhon is on the far right, and all of the rest of the people in the photographs are his siblings.
Wow.
So that's an typical sized Dungan family. Yeah. Next is a photo of Dzhon in 1974 with his younger brother, Vieni Amin, and Dzhon is on the right in this photo. And you can see on his shoulder the what looks like CA or SA in Russia, Sovietskaya Armia, Soviet Army. He was on a break from the Soviet Army, as was his brother at the time when they took the photo. And the last photo I will show is Dzhon in 1981 with Dungan friends in the back row. He is the third from the left in the back row, and then National Poets of Kyrgyzstan. This was actually a jubilee or a celebration of a birthday of Yasser Shavaza, who is in the middle on the front in the front row, the best known Dungan writer, and in the front row on the left is the Kyrgyz poet Ali Tolkambayev, who wrote under the pseudonym Balka, and on the far right is Musa Zhaganziev. Okay. In part three, I'd like to provide a bit of theoretical framework for the study of Dzhon's ethnographic poetry and narrative. So as a branch of anthropology, ethnography is concerned with the systematic study of individual cultures, mostly using participant observation. So Dzhon here really stands out as a native ethnographer, that is, an ethnic Dungan studying his own people, since the classic ethnographic paradigm has been that of the non-native ethnographer or someone on the outside looking in. Next, I'd like to make a few comments about literary anthropology or anthropological poetics. So Dzhon's literary works are also examples of literary anthropology, or what is sometimes also known as anthropological poetics. So the development of literary anthropology gained momentum in the 1980s, relatively recently, but it originated in the pioneering work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, whose work on kinship structures in the 1940s and whose study of myth turned the attention of anthropologists to the important and neglected dimension of language. Since the mid 1980s, anthropology has become more open to literary theory and literary forms, with ethnographic poetry thus gaining increasing acceptance as a mode of representation. This is also true for related social science fields, and there's been a proliferation of experimental approaches to ethnography since the 1990s, which has led to the increasing visibility not only of ethnographic poetry, but also of ethnographic fiction, memoirs, biographies, or a pastiche of various forms. Dzhon's literary works also contribute to the field of Russophone studies, specifically the study of Russophone literature, which can be broadly defined as literature written in the Russian language by authors who do not identify as Russian, and can be considered within the broader transnational and post-colonial framework that has been rapidly emerging in Russian, East European, and Eurasian literary studies. So Russophone writers like Dzhon find themselves at a distance from civic, national, or ethnic conceptions of Russianness. So, but this idea of Russophonia, which is a term that's actually been coined by Naomi Caffey, who's currently at Reed College, it ultimately speaks to the decolonization of Russian literature. And finally, the publication of Dzhon's collected poems and short stories in my annotated English translation also represents an important contribution to Sinophone studies, as it will help to draw more global attention to the unique case presented by the Dungans in the Sinophone debate. So the relation between Chinese cultural identity and the use of Chinese written characters or sinographs is a frequent topic of discussion among historians of China. The Dungans represent a unique case, as they have never used Chinese written characters to write their native language. Yet it is well known that they have managed in diaspora to maintain their Chineseness to a very large extent. The study of Dungan cultural identity in all its aspects, including the examination of the exceedingly rich and extensive literary tradition of the Dungans, including Dzhon's literary output, offers crucial insights into the Sinophone debate. And this is something I discuss as well in the introduction to my English language volume. Okay, now I would like, in part 4, the last and longest section of the presentation, I'd like to discuss Dzhon's poetry and prose as it appears in my annotated English edition. So this is the cover image of the English language edition. And it is actually that the image itself in the upper part of the cover is adapted from the 2011 Russian language edition that published many of Dzhon's poetry, which appear in my English language edition. The image was created for that edition by Ali Dzhon's younger son, Ismar Dzhon, who is regarded as a leading graphic designer in Kyrgyzstan. Okay. So I'd like to give you comments about the introductory chapter to the English language edition, and it is titled Dzhon and His Place in the Dungan Literary World. So here I provide a brief biography of Dzhon, including photographs from Dzhon's personal archives, some of which I showed you today. I also provide Dzhon's own comments on the title poem, Mystical Forest, which really sets the tone for the collection. I translated his comments actually from Russian. And also, I also translated a message to readers of the English language edition, and also offer a selected bibliography. So the bibliography is a list of book-length works, scholarly articles, and scholarly book contributions attributed to Dzhon based on his own reporting of his published works as of early 2022. So in addition to his two published volumes of Russian language poetry, which I already mentioned, Dzhon has published more than 50 scholarly monographs and articles in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, China, and Japan. Okay. So in my
I'll bet some more.
English, yeah, right. So in my English edition, I have grouped Dzhon's poems thematically into 9 chapters. And the 10th is his short fiction. So there was no particular organizing principle when the poems appeared in the 2 published Russian language volumes that I've mentioned already, published in 2011 and 2021. So the poems in the English language edition that Dzhon wrote after the 2011 publication, which is called Maya Osin, or My Autumn, um, these actually were posted in roughly chronological order on Dzhon's social media account, Odnoklasniki, which means classmates. And it ranks slightly higher than Facebook now in Russia and the former Soviet republics. Um, so, so the first chapter is called Poems of Rumination. And among these is a moving poem titled February 7th, 2020, which is, as some of you may be aware, the date when interethnic conflict broke out within Kordai Rayon, or Kordai district in Kazakhstan, during the Dungan Kazakh ethnic clashes that occurred over the course of several days in early February 2020. And he has other verse that also makes reference to that particular conflict. Chapter 2 is called Poems of Autobiographical Nature. This chapter includes poems with a somber or serious tone, such as I Am to Blame, Fears, and Testimony on an Ethnic Topic, as well as those with a more playful or satirical tone, such as I Will Drink Life to the Lees, After Carousal, and Metamorphosis, subtitled A Donkey's Dream. Chapter 3 is called Poems About Family. So among these poems are those dedicated to his wife, who is a Koryo Saram, or ethnic Korean in the post-Soviet states. The poems also make reference to his 2 sons, Yevgeny and Ismar, and to his mother, Valentina Sergeyevna, who you saw earlier in the photograph, and she is an ethnic Russian, and as well as to his granddaughter, Avrora, who is the daughter of his younger son, Ismar. Chapter 4 is called Poems About Love. And these poems include, again, those with a more serious tone, as well as those with a lighter tone, such as, for example, the poem entitled A Joke of Old Eros. Chapter 5 is called Poems of Friendship. Several of these poems, as you can see, are dedicated to Dzhon's Dungan friends and colleagues, including Muhammed Husizovich Imazov, Mar Vundizovich Rumaza, and Ishar Shisir. So, the poem A Tree is a dedication to Yasser Shivaza, who I mentioned earlier, the most celebrated poet of the Dungans and a Kyrgyz national poet. Shivaza was also a writer of fictional prose, linguist, translator, and social activist during the Soviet period. And if you're interested in more information about Shivaza, there is actually an English language volume about him that was published in 1991, I believe, by Svetlana Dyer, and the publisher is Peter Lang. There's more information about this actually on my website, which I'll mention at the end of the presentation if you're interested in these links that I'm mentioning here and these references to other Dungan scholars. Chapter 6 is called Poems of Nostalgia. And these poems reference some of the many places Dzhon has spent time in, including areas of Russia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Chapter 7 is called Poems of Melancholy. And these poems include an early poem of Dzhon's written in 1970 entitled Emulating Sergei Yesenin, who, as some of you may know, was a famous Russian lyric poet of the silver age of Russian poetry from the early part of the 20th century. He lived from 1895 and 1925. He died tragically of suicide. And this also shows, that particular poem shows the strong influence of Russian writers on Dzhon's own poetic production. Chapter 8 is titled Poems of Nationalistic Character. Among these poems is Unrest, one of the longest poems in the collection, and this is a heart-wrenching piece about the first Dungan migration from Northwest China to Russian Central Asia following the suppression of the Dungan revolt in the late 19th century. To Dzhon Kasim is another interesting poem dedicated to Dzhon's late uncle and all the veterans of the Great Patriotic War, as you can see from the subtitle, or as it's better known in the West, World War II. So Dzhon Kasim, the older brother of Aliyevich Dzhon's father, was in fact quite well known among the Dungans because he was a jeweler who crafted traditional pieces. In the 1930s, he became artistic director of a professional music ensemble that performed folk tunes at the Philharmonic of the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. And he went missing in action in the battles near Stalingrad in the Great Patriotic War. And then just one other poem I'd like to mention in this chapter is Bai Yin Hu. Bai Yin Hu is the best known among the anti-Qing Hui commanders to flee to Russian territory. So also known as Mohammed Ayub, he was a rebel from Shanxi who fled with several thousand of his followers following their defeat in the Dungan revolt. That lasted from 1862 to 1877, settling in the village of Karakunuz, present-day Masanchi, Kazakhstan, near the border with Kyrgyzstan. And the group numbered slightly over 3,300 upon arrival in the spring of 1878. And this is, again, according to figures provided by Svetlana Dyer. Chapter 9 is called Poems of Religious Character, the last chapter of poetry. The poem Dua pertains to the act of supplication regarded by Muslims as a profound act of worship. Um, and the poem Friday Prayer is about the special congregational prayer Muslims hold every Friday in the early afternoon in place of the ordinary Zuhr prayer. And finally, I just would like to make a few comments about chapter 10, which contains the 4 short stories that I've translated for this particular collection. So the first 3 of the 4 short stories, The Bicycle, Tales of Grandmother Mayan, and The Last Song, were previously published in Dungan translation in the Dungan newspaper, 10月第七, which means October banner in Dungan. The 4th story, Bitter Root, which in Russian is Gorky Korin, has neither been published in the original Russian nor been published in translation until now. So just very briefly, The Bicycle is a story about a Dungan's youth's attempt to retrieve his treasured bicycle, which leads to important revelations of identity and self. Tales of Grandmother Mayan is about a grandmother telling her young grandson about the strange goings-on in a vacated neighborhood house that the villagers believe to be cursed, and a mysterious incident soon ensues on the manor. The Last Song is a story that searches for the meaning behind a sad melody played by an old man on his camus, which is a 3-stringed fretless lute used in Central Asian music. And finally, Bitter Root is a short story structured as a dialogue or playlet, and it follows the life paths of of 2 individuals and the mutually unanswered yearnings of an unnamed man and woman, beginning from their school-age friendship through their time as parents to growing children. Finally, I would just like to read to you my English language translation of the title poem, which is Mystical Forest, Tiny Lias in Russian. And you will note the visual pattern of the poem here resembling a tree of sorts. And this style of visual poetry, which combines visual art and written expression to create new ways of presenting and interpreting poetry, is used by Dzhon quite effectively throughout his collection of poems as he plays with form. And I should just maybe mention that this was actually one of the more difficult parts for me to actually transfer, if you will, from the original poems into the English, because the proofing process actually doesn't accommodate very well these strange sort of indentations and use of white space in the proofing process. But I managed to do it, as you can see from my English language translation. So I'm offering my version of the poem on 2 different slides, just so for ease of reading the English. So I will read it to you. This appears on page 20 in my English language edition, and it contains extracted images from that main image that you already saw on the front cover. So there is a mountain forest, verdant on the slopes, and high atop are dry maples. Beasts dwell there, deep are their dens. Unicorns, too, are to be found. Jewels are hidden in the recesses of the canyons, and wayfarers make their way, sleepless and aimless. Flowers blossom like vivid carpets. Upon them dance children with innocent eyes. In dark corners, owls burst out laughing, and blackbirds peck at the hemlock. In the thicket flourish meanness and magnanimity. Together nest extravagance and penury. The lion and the rabbit share the same bed. Still, there too is exceeding anguish. It roars, destroying all in its path, and gnaws at the forest called the soul. So, with respect to the meaning of the title poem, Dzhon himself writes, right, and I'm quoting here, the forest itself is a mystery since an individual does not know what awaits him beyond the next group of trees or in the next clearing. Thus, as I see it, the human soul, its inner world, and actions are the quote forest, end quote, and the quote mystery, end quote, which is at times undisclosed and incomprehensible in its motives to the individual itself. And this quote and other comments by Dzhon appear on page 8 in my edition. So in closing, I would just like to mention some of the salient features that are to be found in Dzhon's writing. So for, his lyric turns of phrase, the vividness of his descriptions, his keen wit, the humbleness of his character, his genuine candor, the intensity of his emotions, his devotion to his family, his friends, and his faith. And last but not least, his overwhelming concern for the past, present, and future of his native people, the Dungans of Central Asia. So I hope that readers of Mystical Forest, the English language edition of Dzhon's works, will go away with a better understanding of Dzhon as a multifaceted individual who is at once the most important ethnographer of the Dungans and a masterful poet and writer. So, I'm sorry. So for further information about my work on the Dungans, including Mystical Forest, as well as my earlier book, Dungan Folktales and Legends, which Professor Tai already mentioned, that appeared in 2021 with Peter Lang. Please visit my personal academic website on Georgetown Domains. The URL is kjy.georgetown.domains. And you can also find links to many of the researchers that I mentioned during my talk today, such as Svetlana Rybsky-Korsakov-Dyer, as well as others, on the Dungan Studies webpage that's developing on my website. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I've also placed a few of the links to which Dr. Yin referred in the chat box, so you can see some of them. I hope that will be helpful. I noticed that the Dungan people are also discussed by the Joshua Project and some other demographic projects that talk about people of faith. So I guess I'd like to open by just asking if you might comment a little bit more on their involvement as a diaspora people. I mean, it seems like even if this is a poet who has written in Russian, that they're really situated between three language traditions that I can think of, not just Russian, but also Chinese and possibly also Arabic. Is there any use of Arabic in this poetry?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, Professor Tai. So, yeah, as a diaspora people, so their native language, Dungan, is actually a form of Mandarin Chinese, but it's not the Beijing Mandarin, if you will. It's
Hmm.
from Northwest China, mainly from Shanxi and Gansu. Um, Depending on who you're talking to, there's some perhaps level of intelligibility between, let's say, the modern standard Chinese, which is based on the Beijing dialect, right? What somebody would learn as a Chinese as a second language, and Dungan language. I find it very difficult, and most of my colleagues who only know the standard Beijing Mandarin find it very hard to actually understand the spoken Dungan language, aside from isolated words. However, it's interesting that the Dungan speakers themselves will say that they can understand quite well the speakers of Beijing Mandarin. So that's an interesting point there. Yeah, and of course, um, um, uh, they know they study Russian, of course. Was of course mandatory during the Soviet period, but even since then, the in the republics of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, where most of them are, Russian is a co-official language together with the titular languages of Kazakh or Kyrgyz. Um, and in terms of the Arabic, before the adoption of a written form for the Dungan language, which they did not have when they first arrived on the Central Asian soil in the winter of 1877, 1878. There was actually only use of what's called Xiao which is a form which was based on Arabic because it was used primarily for annotations of religious texts, and it's still actually used by Hui over in China now, northwestern China. So the Dungas had originally brought this over, and they're but only the very educated and the religious had access to this shell arging. And so it wasn't actually in wide use because most of the guns, as I mentioned, were illiterate peasants or small
Hmm.
craftsmen. So there wasn't really any written form until the experimentation with the Latin scripts for the Dungan language in the 19 after the establishment of the Soviet Union, 1920s, 1930s, and finally the switch to a Cyrillic
Hmm.
alphabet for the Dungans in the 50s, as
Hmm.
had happened with other of the Central Asian peoples, as well as other Soviet ethnic minorities,
Right,
as you know. Yeah.
right. Yeah. Because
So
these are, yeah.
yeah, and at present, there's a lot of interest I know now for the Dungans to have their children actually study Kazakh and Kyrgyz, as I mentioned, because that's being used in, for example, in a lot of the government offices and also for business purposes. Even if Russian is also sometimes used, there's definitely a push, I think, in those republics for those languages to be used. So the parents actually are pushing for their children, I know, to actually have, for example, Kyrgyz or Kazakh language instruction in the schools,
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
addition to just Russian and perhaps also Dungan.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, I know
So,
that in several former Soviet republics, in Georgia and Uzbekistan, generally there's like a sort of a hierarchy of languages. You know, you have a choice about which foreign language you want to learn first. And there's been a shift, I think, since the end of the Soviet Union from Russian to English. But ethnic languages are now sort of gaining more purchase. I remember in Uzbekistan noticing the rise of Tajik as a language, and
right.
and I'm sort of interested here. There's Sunni Muslims
Yes.
but they must have uh, some, they must have had some exposure to Persian language as well, surely, or no?
Yeah. Um, I guess they would be perhaps more in with the Uzbek Dungans.
Mm-hmm.
I would think just from what I know more about Uzbekistan,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that has the fewest number though of
Yeah,
the
no, I noticed that. Yes.
Dungans, only about 3,000. So that's actually doesn't come up a lot, either in Dzhon's writings or even in my first book about the Dungan folktales and legends,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
because it's such a minority of the Dungans who are there, and they a lot of those also Uzbek Dungans have become assimilated, from what I understand, to the larger Dungan society. And a lot of them actually just only speak Dungan. I mean, I'm sorry, only speak Uzbek or Russian, and
Mm-hmm.
have do not speak Dungan. And some of them also lost connection with the Dungan culture, from what I understand. But
Mm-hmm.
I have seen a few. There are actually videos if you go to my YouTube channel. Um, I have a link. There are actually some Dungan like wedding videos that come out of Uzbekistan. I have seen that actually has been documented, and
Mm-hmm.
there is also a or was, I should say, a Dungan um, uh, cultural center for the in Uzbekistan, but
Yes.
they may be defunct. I'm not sure if that's
No, I don't think it is
it's
defunct. It's
still
still
there.
around.
Yeah,
It's
I'm
still
not sure how
around.
regularly it's being updated though, but yeah.
Yeah.
So
I guess, the other question that's occurring to me as a historian is hearing a little bit more about what the rebellion was about. I mean, the Qing dynasty were equal opportunity offenders. I think of my husband's people who were Hakka, who wound up in the Caribbean because of the Taiping rebellion. So I'm just wondering, were they suppressing the Dungan for any specific reason? Or was this just sort of generally the way that the Qing were intolerant to everyone and somewhat repressive?
yeah, I would probably say the latter,
Uh-huh.
because there were also other conflicts, rebellions, or going on,
Mhm.
both before and then also after this particular Dungan rebellion.
Mhm.
So, and I think it was just sort of, and this particular rebellion that led to the migration of the Dungans from China to Central Asia had been going on for 1862 to 1877, so quite a number of years.
Right. Yeah.
So there was a lot of sort of tension there that would just sort of been simmering, I think, as one of the larger um, ethnic minorities. And this was again, it was called the Dungan Revolt, but Dungan at that time wasn't used to refer specifically to the Dungans as the way that I'm using it for the presentation today, meaning the Russian speaking Dungans in Central Asia. Of course, there were none even during the rebellion, correct?
Right.
But that was a term that came from the Western scholars, European scholars, I believe, like
Mhm.
historians who had used that earlier, and that was a general term to refer to the Chinese Muslims in general, Dungan.
Mhm.
So, in fact, during that particular rebellion, the Dungan rebellion, as I called it, or the Tongzhi Hui rebellion, or
Mhm.
Muslim minorities rebellions, a lot of the participants were, in fact, Uyghurs,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
together with the Hui, and there were also Kazakhs as
Mhm.
well,
Mhm.
and they also migrated following the suppression of the revolt in
Right.
1877, 1878. And that's how the Uyghurs got over first,
Mhm.
to what was then Russian Central Asia, and also
Mhm.
the Kazakhs as well.
Mhm.
So it
Mhm.
wasn't just limited, this conflict or tension just between who I'm calling the Dungans now, the Sinophone sort of Muslims
Mhm.
that are actually in Central Asia, but in general,
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
conflict between these Muslim peoples. Yes,
Right.
and
So it was overall a discomfort with the presence of Muslims in
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And of course, I mean, according to the current numbers from the Pew Research Center, the Hui and the Uyghurs actually account for 90% actually of the Islamic minorities within China. So they
mm-hmm.
actually were the two largest group. I think the numbers exactly were, I think 43% today um, are the Uyghurs, I believe, and 46% are Hui, and then the other 10 or 11% are the other Islamic groups. Yeah. So
I have a question.
sure.
Huh?
Can
Can
you
you
hear
hear
me?
me?
You have a question, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I didn't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a linguistic question. How do tones get translated into Russian? How is it done, right? Because h- how does it happen?
Yeah.
Because
No.
go ahead.
No. That's a great question. Yeah. So a lot of the um, early scholarly attention actually on Dungan was in fact on the language itself because of this very sort of interesting fact that it's the only form of Chinese to this day that's actually written with an alphabet, right? When it
Right.
was first the experimentation first with the two Latin alphabets, and then the use of the Cyrillic alphabet from 1953, until the
Mm.
present day. So in terms of the tone, it's really interesting because the tone is not actually represented in the Cyrillic, right? I mean, there's no easy way to represent it. And so
Right.
it's actually not represented in the Cyrillic. So the alphabet that was eventually decided upon for the Dungan language, officially there was experimentation from 1953 all the way to 55. It was officially adopted in 1955. It includes all of the letters of the Russian alphabet and then I believe three additional Cyrillic um, letters. But there has been no need according to the Dungans, to indicate, in fact, the tones because it's in when it's used in context,
Yeah, context, exactly. You know
it's
which
actually clear. It's always clear exactly which particular
were
syllable you're using or talking
yeah.
about. Yeah.
Uh,
So it's a really interesting point because again, I think this speaks to something that is sometimes brought up in the Sinophone debate that I mentioned earlier, right?
mm,
Where some of the advocates of sort of keeping the characters in Chinese and saying how Chinese culture can never be severed from use of the Chinese characters, right?
mm.
There are some that are very adamant about that, and the case of the Dugan language flies in the face of this very clearly, that you can actually write a form of Chinese using an alphabet without the indication of tone
Oh, that's
that
that
it
that's good.
actually is possible. Yeah. And actually, if you're interested in more information about this, Victor Mayer of the University of Pennsylvania actually writes quite a bit about this. Mair.
MAIR.
Yeah, Victor Mayer, University of Pennsylvania. And he actually writes about this on his language log,
Okay.
which he runs out of or used to run out of the University of Pennsylvania, but he still contributes to that. If you
Okay.
type his name, Victor Mayer, yeah. So, but
Uh,
it's a fascinating issue. And there's been a lot of research about just Dungan linguistics in general, and also including um, some comments about the tone because of this sort of
yeah.
Dungan is anomalous in terms of its
Yeah.
status as a written language. Yeah.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So I guess the one other question that I have is, um, the it's clear that the Muslim population in China always faced tremendous challenges. Is there any continuity here? Are the Hui who remain in China facing the same kind of persecution that has hit certainly Western newsreels about what's going on with Uyghurs? Are they also being swept up in some of what's going on in China right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I'm sure everybody's heard about the the what the Chinese are calling the re-education camps, right? Which we
Yes.
know to sort of be otherwise. Yeah, that has targeted a lot, mainly from what I understand, the Uyghurs, but it
Mhm.
also has affected Hui, some of the Hui as well, right? Hui, and also Kazakhs, from what I understand,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So, but the largest number, yes, being the Uyghurs, which I'm sure everybody is sort of
Yeah.
aware of.
Well, I mean, there's some activism around that, in the United States and Canada, I believe, with families who've already come over to the United States. But it seems like there's a concern in general about cultural Islam and the way in which that might diminish a full apprehension of Chineseness, whatever
Right.
the heck that is, right? And so I was just wondering if the Hui had been part of this as well, and it sounds like they are.
Yeah. I think they've been somewhat, compared to, for example, the Uyghurs, the Hui have been somewhat maybe less of a target of the Chinese government, though because of the fact that they actually are Chinese speaking Muslims,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And therefore are somewhat um, uh, in somewhat in a lot of ways are somewhat less distinguishable from the Han Chinese, right? The
Mhm.
majority, because they're speaking the same language, they don't have
Mhm.
their own sort of native language, if you will, and also they have assimilated the Han sort of traditions and culture in many ways as well, you see.
Mhm.
I mean, the distinguishing characteristic, I guess, of the Hui is when they're praying, let's say, and they're wearing like the skull caps
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
or something like that. But
Yeah.
otherwise, a lot of times you might not know, even just by looking at somebody, if they were necessarily a Hui as opposed to a Han.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
I think in that way, um, they've perhaps been a little bit less under the radar, from what I understand,
Mhm. Mhm.
in China.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
So
And
it's just
yeah,
No, I mean, I'm just as you're describing them, what's really sort of leaping out at me is the kind of sort of chameleon thing that happens in a diaspora community, right? Wherever they go, they pick it up. And it's
right.
interesting to me because when they talk about the Jewish minority that is in China, probably immediately after or right after the Babylonian captivity, that you have groups that come to China and they seem to have intermarried with the Muslim population and been absorbed by the Muslim population.
Ah,
Uh,
interesting.
yeah, so I mean, it's kind of interesting to me that you have these various strains within uh, Muslim Sino populations. But I was also interested to know, do we have Dungans here in the United States? Is there a community?
Yes. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So, there actually are Dungans in the United States, and currently there's actually even a Dungan Cultural Center of America, as it's called. I actually helped the person to actually come up with that name actually for the association, which is
Uh-huh.
which was established officially a few years ago. They actually have, I think it's an Instagram page,
Uh-huh.
and it was set up by the person who was running the only Dungan restaurant ever in the U.S., which opened in Brooklyn. I think it was
Ah,
2018. And there was a large article about it in the New York Times, which is how
uh-huh.
I found out about it and then visited the restaurant in Brooklyn, near Brighton Beach, sort of not far from there.
Oh, really?
And
So
we
they're part
started,
of, so they emigrated when they got here, they became part of sort of the Russian diaspora, the larger
right,
Russian
they
diaspora.
sort of living in the same because they're Russian
Oh,
speakers. Yeah. And
interesting.
he was trying to reach out to what in Russian is the Dungan people, but in I should also mention in Russian and other in Russian in general, and also in places among the Turkic peoples in northwest China, the term Dungan actually means all of the Hui, what I've been referring to as Hui, or the Muslim, the Chinese-speaking Muslims, it actually
Mm-hmm.
refers to.
Mm-hmm.
So when he was trying to, let's say, unite when he came to the U.S., the Dungan in Russian, or the Chinese-speaking Muslims or Hui people, he found that most of those who responded to him were actually Hui who were from China, as opposed to the Dungans
Ah,
in Central Asia. But there were some of them. There were
uh-huh.
some of them that responded. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, and then I through my own research and everything, I've actually found out that there are other um, Dungans living, for example, in Florida. He has since closed the restaurant, unfortunately, and moved to Chicago.
Ah,
Um, but there are some that are
mhm.
actually in the US, and there was a group that actually visited also last January because there was a Dungan conference conducted in the Russian language at George Washington University in DC in January of last year.
I remember that in Astoria we had a Muslim, a kosher Muslim Chinese restaurant, Fatima's, which was a big hit. And
Oh,
I'm pretty sure from some of what you've described in your talk today that those were the folks running it, that they were Hui. Because at the time I remember sort of thinking, gee, they look Chinese, and they were, I think they were speaking Chinese, or they were speaking a dialect of Chinese. So it was kind of interesting. So we have them even here in Queens.
yeah, yeah, no, that's wonderful. Yeah, yeah. So I mean the social media that I check out very regularly, you could see the links on my Dungan Studies page. Yeah, a lot of them, again, they're using the term in Russian Dungan, but it also, and they mean the Hui in China
Hmm.
as well. I mean, in the former Soviet republics, as well as those in China. They also are sort of reaching out to those people as
Hmm.
well. But in a certain sense, it is sort of more to the people in the former Soviet republic, since the postings are in Russian, of course.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right. But
Do,
and I should also mention though that there's also been an effort on the Chinese part to also reach out to the Dungans, the ones in Central Asia, to actually offer them scholarships in the Shanxi province. Actually, it's at Northwestern Normal University. They offer them, it's something that's been going on for quite some years, where they offer undergraduates who are ethnic Dugans from Central Asia to go over to Northwest
hmm.
Normal University. And if they decide to major in Chinese language, that they
Ah,
actually get a full scholarship,
uh-huh.
and like the 4 years, I believe is entirely covered by the
Hmm.
university. But
Hmm.
it's a win-win situation for both sides, because the Chinese realize how important these Dungans are as mediators, as they look towards Central Asia also as a growing and very, very important market for
Hmm.
them. And the Dungans also in the former Soviet province also understand that, how they're also in a very advantageous sort of position because of their linguistic sort of cultural heritage,
Right.
if you will, that if they try to reclaim that,
Hmm.
whether they can speak some Dungan from home or not, that they have these opportunities open to them, and
Hmm.
they can help with the substantial number of Chinese entrepreneurs that have moved into um, Central Asia, right? To do business with Central Asia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and especially now with the the war with Ukraine, right? Exactly, right. That they're they're thinking, what are other partners in Central Asia besides possibly Russia and China? China is a large one, of course, right?
Living along the Silk Road, nothing changes.
Exactly, exactly. So yeah, it's just really fascinating what's sort of going on there. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Yeah.
Do we have other questions?
I just have one question, linguistic again. What do the Uyghurs speak? You said it's not Chinese, right?
Yeah. So the no, well, I guess Chinese would be if they spoke Dungan. That's like a sort of like a non-Beijing form of Mandarin. The non
Right. No,
standard.
but you were saying that the Uyghurs there were I forgot what the issue was, but something where the Dugans weren't as currently aren't as discriminated against as the Uyghurs.
Oh, in China.
Right.
Yeah, in China. Yeah. So in terms of what they speak in Central Asia, they would use most of them are at least bilingual, meaning they would have some sort of knowledge of Dungan, as an ethnic, as a home language at least. Also, Russian would be, of course, taught in the
No,
schools.
but
Yeah.
you were talking about what's going on in China now, something with what's going on in China, and you said Emily was asking, are they are they part of this sort of, I don't know what it is, cleansing
Yeah.
that's going on in China?
Ethnically,
And you
yeah.
said probably not as much as the Uyghurs,
Right.
because
Oh, right. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, they're not as much of the target by the targets really of the campaign overwhelmingly are actually the Uyghurs, although there are some like Hui who are also in that, or um Kazakhs perhaps, right? But it really seems to be that Xinjiang area, right, where there are well, the Xinjiang, it used to be called, or officially it's called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
uh,
So that's where you find the large concentration of the Uyghurs, and they are readily distinguishable in their appearance from, let's say, the Han, right? And if they're speaking Uyghur, they're obviously speaking a different language. But there's also a history also of Uyghurs sort of being among the more outspoken, if you will, among the minority groups,
uh,
in China. So that also, I'm sure, is something that the Chinese government is sort of is considering. So what I was talking about is about the fact that in these Hui in China, they're assimilated in many ways to the Han, or almost like indistinguishable for the Han for the most part,
and
because there is no other language that they speak besides Chinese,
yeah, and
right?
the Uyghurs speak a different language.
Yes, right. Uyghur is actually one of the Turkic languages,
Oh, it's a Turkic. Oh, okay. I
right?
didn't realize. Ah,
Which is related, well, to Turkish, but related to all
right.
of the Central Asian
Yeah,
languages, of
right,
course.
exactly. The
In
Turkic
the
languages in,
in the
yeah.
former Soviet republics, related to Kazakh and
Ah,
Kyrgyz, Uzbek.
oh, okay. I
Yeah,
didn't
also
realize.
Chinese languages of like Dongshang, Salar, Tatar. Well, Tatar also being spoken, of course, in Russia. But all of these, yeah, it's related actually to those minority languages.
So the Uyghurs speak a Turkish language.
Turkic, yeah,
Yeah,
Turkic.
Turkic. Yeah,
yeah.
not
Yeah.
Turkish.
Turkish being the largest
Yeah,
representation.
Turkic is the group. Yeah,
Yeah, as the group. Yeah,
yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
exactly. Yeah.
Uh, okay.
So,
That's what I was wondering. How were they distinguishable? But they speak a Turkic language.
right,
They don't.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
Okay.
kind of ironic, actually, that there are Uyghurs in China speaking a Turkic language that's more identified with the Central Asian region, and then you have the immigration of the Hui, who are, sort of more culturally ambidextrous in some ways.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
but very seeped, obviously, in Russian culture as well.
Yeah. Although many of these people in, for example, in Xinjiang and other areas, many of the official ethnic minority groups in China also actually speak Turkic languages, as I just mentioned to Jack. Kazakhs, one of the larger groups, Dongxiang people, Salars, for example, smaller number of Uzbeks and Tatars, but also, a sort of Turkic languages as well. Yeah. But, the Uyghurs being the largest sort of in terms of numbers. So that may also make them more of a target in some way. I think the figures was 43%, according to the Pew Research Center, the latest figures. 43% of the Islamic minorities in China are actually Uyghur. 46% are Hui, and then the others are, the other groups that I sort of mentioned. Yeah. So it's interesting actually that if you're interested in the language that was the predecessor of for example, like Uyghur and Uzbek and others of these Turkic languages, it's called a Chagatai.
Okay.
One of my colleagues at George Washington University, Eric Schlussel, I'll put a little plug for him, right? He actually recently came out with a textbook to teach Chagatai, which he did when he was a PhD student at Harvard. And it developed into a book that he's actually put out. And I'm sure at Harvard, when they teach Chagatai now, they still use his book, right? So yeah, so if you're interested in, Jack or whoever, in learning a little bit more about, the Turkic language in Chagatai, there's actually a textbook out with that. But yeah, he's an amazing amazing scholar. Yeah, he hosted
his name is
Eric Schlussel.
Oh,
yeah, SCH. I'll put it in the chat. Eric SCHLUESSEL at George Washington University. Yeah. And the language Chag, it's spelled different ways. I think Chagatai. Chagatai can be spelled different ways. That's one of the ways. The other. Yeah, those are two of the ways that Chagatai can be spelled.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated by the name of the language because, of course, that's like the ethnic
thank
group
you
that preceded, that the whole area that was that Tashkent was part of that original sort of kingdom, and you still have a few relics of that period. There's one set of frescoes that are exhibited that I remember seeing in Tashkent that reflect that that cultural disposition, which is an interesting sort of Silk Road society because it reflects some influences from the Indian subcontinent as well as what we might think of as Chinese influences. And
right,
that there's I'm fascinated by the fact that is identified as the language because it was also sort of mentioned at when we were there as a kind of a geographic culture in a preceding area where there was where the kings were sort of negotiating with the Persians, negotiating with the Buddhists, threading their way through it in the pre-Islamic period, and sort of trying to maintain their independence between a couple of major cultures. So yeah, that's sort of interesting.
Yeah.
Again, echoes of the Silk Road.
Yeah, and I guess I'll mention here too that part of the area now that's considered, former Soviet Central Asia, as well as like the Russian large part of the Russian Far East was in fact part of the Chinese Empire, and through the Qing Dynasty. I believe it was 1860 actually is when it was given over. Let's use that term, like the Russian Far Eastern part of Central Asia, which includes like part of President Kyrgyzstan, to the Russians. And by Chinese scholars, it's considered, that it was sort of a time when maybe the Chinese were exploited because it was a weak period,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in terms of the Chinese history and the Qing rule.
Mm-hmm.
But so in fact, I mean, I believe it's the area around Bishkek was actually the place where a very well-known Chinese poet Li Bo or Li Bai was actually born.
Mm-hmm.
It's present in Kyrgyzstan, which is actually in, you know, former Soviet Republic, but he's a very
Mm-hmm.
well-known, you know, Chinese actually poet who wrote in Chinese, but of, you know, of Central Asian background. So Li Bo or Li Bai, and he's a Tang dynasty poet.
Mm-hmm.
So there's actually quite a few
Mm-hmm.
English translations of him
Mm-hmm.
if you were interested in reading about. But he comes from that area as
Mm-hmm.
well, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, but all of that area of the Russian Far East as well, which is actually a developing interest of mine, is the Siberian actually Tungus
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
peoples and cultures. And it actually is specifically that area of that Russian Far East that used to actually belong to China until the 19th century, the late
Mm-hmm.
19th century. But then, you know, at a moment of weakness, if you will, or whatever, you know, in the Qing rule, that it actually became Russian
Yeah.
territory and has sort of remained since. And Russians actually got carved out a bit more of that territory some years later, and that
Mm-hmm.
has remained therefore part of the what was then the Russian Empire, and now, you know, of Russia, that part. So yeah, so my interest again is sort of this historical culture interest, sort of in the borderlands, this frontier, the China frontier with ethnic minorities.
Mm-hmm.
I became interested in specifically the Udagir and the Nanai
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
peoples who are in the Russian Far East.
Mm-hmm.
So their languages, you know, being indigenous peoples, unfortunately, are dying out. They're writing in Russian still. So I'm just fascinated by what I'm able to get my hands on at this
Mm-hmm.
time, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of
Mm-hmm.
the literature. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm trying to see what I can do in terms of getting out some of that sort of information and knowledge to a more sort of global audience,
Yeah. Yeah.
translations and talks as well. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I
But
think one of the things that your scholarship really sort of brings out is how in general, there's so much discussion now about the way that English becomes a conduit for various cultures, diaspora cultures that become part of the American sphere of influence. But Russia sort of absorbed something similar because Central Asia was a polyglot of so many different cultures. And, during the 19th century so-called Great Game, in some ways, the Russians see the value of being protective of some of these individual cultures in trying to distinguish themselves from, say, the British, who are also in the region. So you wind up with some preservation. I mean, I know the same kind of thing happens in some ways in Georgia and Armenia, where the cultural integrity of the region is one way that the Soviets can kind of sell themselves as a more benign colonial power.
mhm.
So it leaves some things there that can be preserved. Um, so this is a very, very rich discussion. I would like to know if anybody else has any more questions. I think
I'm fine.
yeah,
I'm
we
fine.
lost a few people, but I hope that they'll be able to profit from some of the material that you shared in the chat box. And as you saw, I tried to do the same.
Friday
Um,
afternoon prayer, perhaps, for the
what,
Sunni Muslim, right? I was thinking that, right? If you go ahead and
um,
but they'll have access to the video because I will
yes, yes,
upload this
of
to the
course.
YouTube
And if
channel.
you like, we can also save the chat and send that to you as well. I
Sure, that'd be
believe
great.
Mr. Kodak can do that for me.
I'd
Um,
appreciate that.
so So with that, I'd like to thank everybody who has been part of today's book talk from the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and the Sciences. To thank you all on my own behalf and on behalf of our executive director, Dr. Sarah Danielson, for being part of this event. And if you log on to watch this video afterwards, please check out the website of the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and the Sciences. There is a sponsored conference that is being organized at the Graduate Center next week on banned books. And there are always events of interest for folks in a range of fields because as the CUNY Academy for the Humanities and the Sciences, we support research of City University faculty across the various disciplines. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much to our speaker, Professor Yin of LaGuardia Community College.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.